Hello everyone and welcome to my B&B CBS Gossip 24 channel. Luna's goodbye letter is not merely a piece of paper discovered too late by Will Spencer. It is the slow detonation of every unsaid truth, every restrained emotion, every silent sacrifice that defined their relationship. And when Will finally unfolds it with shaking hands, unaware that the words inside will dismantle the man he believes himself to be, the script becomes a devastating exploration of love delayed, truth postponed, and the irreversible cost of silence, because Luna never intended for Will to read this letter at all, never meant for him to see the version of her that existed only in the quiet hours when she convinced herself that loving him meant letting him go. And the paragraph-long unraveling of this story begins with Will standing alone in the aftermath of her absence, a space still warm with her memory but already hollow, and the letter, tucked away where it was never meant to be found, becomes a voice from the past that refuses to stay buried, whispering confessions that Luna could not say out loud while she was alive because saying them would have meant asking Will to choose, to stay, to sacrifice parts of himself she believed he needed in order to survive. And as he reads, the letter exposes how deeply she understood him, perhaps more deeply than he ever understood her, detailing moments he barely noticed but that shaped her entire emotional world. The way his smile faltered when he thought no one was watching, the way his ambition pulled him forward even when love tugged him back, the way his kindness was often mistaken for strength when it was actually fear of hurting others. And Luna writes not with bitterness but with a devastating gentleness that makes the truth harder to bear, because she does not accuse Will of neglect or cruelty. Instead she absolves him even as she confesses that every time she smiled and said she was fine, she was quietly breaking, believing that loving him meant becoming smaller so that his dreams could remain large. And this is where the script's emotional core tightens, because Will realizes too late that the woman he loved was carrying a private storm, one she shielded him from because she believed her pain was a distraction he could not afford. And the letter reveals that Luna's decision to say goodbye was not an impulsive act of despair but a carefully considered conclusion born from months, perhaps years, of emotional arithmetic, weighing her presence against his future and always finding herself expendable. And as Will reads, his memories reassemble themselves into a crueler, clearer shape. Conversations he once thought insignificant now glow with tragic subtext. Pauses he filled with his own words now echo with the things she wanted to say but didn't. And the letter becomes a mirror forcing him to confront not only Luna's hidden truth but his own blindness, his assumption that love, simply declared, was enough even when he failed to listen. And the script lingers in this discomfort, allowing Will's breakdown to unfold not as a single dramatic moment but as a gradual erosion of certainty, because each paragraph of Luna's letter strips away another comforting lie he told himself, that she was happy, that she would speak up if something was wrong, that there would always be more time. And Luna's voice on the page is heartbreakingly calm, explaining that she didn't want to be remembered as the woman who held him back, didn't want to be the reason he looked over his shoulder instead of forward. And in doing so she exposes the tragic paradox of their love. She loved him so deeply that she erased herself, and Will loved her so unquestioningly that he never noticed she was disappearing. And as the script continues, the letter shifts from confession to farewell, not in the sense of a dramatic goodbye but in the quiet practicality of someone putting emotional affairs in order, thanking Will for the moments that made her feel alive, apologizing for the pain her absence will cause, and asking him almost pleadingly not to turn her choice into a burden he carries forever. A request that is immediately and cruelly impossible because the very act of reading the letter ensures that he will carry it always. And the audience watches Will break not in loud sobs but in the way his body folds inward, as if trying to protect a heart that is suddenly under siege from regret, because the truth she hid was not that she didn't love him but that she loved him so much she believed her silence was an act of mercy. And this revelation changes everything, reframing the narrative of their relationship from one of tragic misunderstanding to one of mutual, if asymmetrical, sacrifice. And the script expertly avoids casting Luna as a martyr or Will as a villain, instead presenting them as two flawed people trapped by their own assumptions about love, assumptions inherited from a world that often teaches us that endurance is the same as devotion and that asking for more is a kind of selfishness. And as Will continues reading, Luna admits that she often imagined what would happen if she told him everything, how she rehearsed the words in her head only to discard them because she was afraid of what he might give up for her, afraid that if he chose her he would someday resent her. And this fear becomes the emotional linchpin of the story, because it reveals how deeply Luna internalized responsibility for Will's happiness, a responsibility he never asked her to carry and yet one he unknowingly benefited from. And when Will finally reaches the end of the letter, there is no cathartic resolution, no neat bow to tie the pain into something meaningful, only the raw understanding that love, left unspoken or half-spoken, can become a kind of slow violence. And the title's promise that Luna's final letter changes everything is fulfilled not through plot twists but through emotional reorientation, because Will is forever altered by the knowledge of who Luna really was and what she endured in silence. And the script's final movement is not about redemption in the traditional sense but about reckoning, about Will learning to live with the truth she hid and allowing it to reshape how he loves, listens and shows up in the world. And the letter, which she never meant him to read, becomes a haunting guidepost for his future, a reminder that the most devastating words are often the ones left unsaid, and that love, when filtered through fear and self-erasure, can become indistinguishable from loss. And as the camera, metaphorically or literally, lingers on Will holding the letter long after he has finished reading, the audience is left with the ache of recognition, the unsettling awareness that many of us carry our own unspoken letters inside us, hoping someone will understand without being told. And the script's enduring power lies in its refusal to offer comfort, instead leaving us with the quiet, devastating truth that sometimes the greatest tragedies are not caused by cruelty or betrayal but by kindness taken too far, by love that chooses silence over risk, and by the painful realization that understanding, when it arrives too late, can be just as destructive as ignorance. And in this way Luna's goodbye letter does not simply destroy Will Spencer. It dismantles the illusion that love alone is enough without courage, communication, and the willingness to be fully seen. And that is why the words she couldn't say out loud echo far beyond the page, transforming a private confession into a universal warning about the cost of hiding our truth from the people we love most. After Will Spencer finishes reading Luna's letter, the story does not end in the silence that follows. Instead, that silence becomes the breeding ground for everything that comes next, because once the truth has been revealed, it refuses to stay contained. And the continuation of the script explores what happens when a man is forced to live forward with knowledge that arrived too late to save the person who gave it. And Will's first instinct is not movement but paralysis, a suspended state, where time seems to bend around him as he sits with the weight of Luna's words pressing into his chest, replaying sentences over and over as if repetition might change their meaning, as if memorization might somehow serve as penance. And the letter, now folded again but never truly closed, becomes an object he cannot put down, because setting it aside feels too much like abandoning her a second time. And this moment marks the transition of the story from revelation to consequence, from emotional discovery to the long, uneven aftermath of grief complicated by guilt. And Will begins to understand that knowing the truth does not absolve him, it implicates him in new ways, because awareness carries responsibility, and responsibility, when paired with regret, becomes a relentless companion, following him through rooms that once felt safe, into conversations that now feel hollow, and into memories that refuse to remain static, constantly rearranging themselves in the light of Luna's confessions. In the days that follow, Will attempts to return to his routines, clinging to structure as if it might anchor him, but everything is subtly altered, because Luna's absence is no longer just physical. It is interpretive, reframing his entire emotional history, and moments that once brought him comfort now ache with unasked questions. And the script takes its time here, resisting the urge to rush toward resolution, instead allowing the audience to sit with Will as he navigates ordinary tasks made unbearable by extraordinary understanding, pouring coffee the way Luna liked it before remembering there is no one left to drink it, hearing her laugh in crowded rooms before realizing it exists only in memory, and most devastatingly, recognizing the ways he benefited from her silence without ever knowing its cost. And this recognition becomes a turning point, because it forces Will to confront not only his love for Luna but the version of himself that love allowed him to remain, a man who believed he was attentive because he cared, who believed that affection could substitute for inquiry, and who believed that if something truly mattered, it would be spoken aloud. And Luna's letter dismantles those beliefs one by one, leaving him with a more uncomfortable truth. That listening requires effort, that presence requires curiosity, and that love demands the courage to ask difficult questions even when the answers might disrupt carefully constructed futures. As the continuation unfolds, Will begins to revisit places that define their relationship, not out of nostalgia but out of compulsion, as if retracing their steps might reveal a moment he missed, a fork in the road where a different choice could have altered everything. And the script uses these visits not as sentimental callbacks but as forensic examinations of intimacy, showing Will standing in spaces where Luna once chose silence, and imagining what she might have said if she believed she had permission. And this imagined dialogue becomes one of the most emotionally charged devices in the continuation, because it highlights the tragedy of unrealized conversations, of words that never had the chance to fail or succeed. And Will starts to understand that Luna's silence was not just about protecting him but about protecting herself from the possibility that her needs would be inconvenient. And this realization unsettles him deeply, because it reveals how power can exist even in relationships that appear equal, how the person with the clearer path forward often becomes the one whose dreams take precedence without ever being explicitly stated. Gradually, Will's grief evolves from raw devastation into something sharper and more purposeful. A need not just to mourn Luna but to honor the truth she revealed. And this is where the continuation begins to explore transformation, not as redemption but as reorientation, because Will cannot undo the past, cannot speak the words she needed to hear, cannot prove that he would have chosen differently if given the chance, but he can choose how he carries her truth forward, and this choice becomes the central question of the second half of the script. What does it mean to live differently because of someone who is gone? And how do you ensure that their silence does not become another story you fail to listen to? And Will's answer is imperfect and evolving, marked by false starts and discomfort because growth born from grief is rarely linear. The script introduces new relationships not as replacements but as mirrors, people who challenge Will in ways Luna never allowed herself to, and these interactions force him to confront how deeply ingrained his patterns are, how easily he slips back into assuming rather than asking, into prioritizing momentum over mutuality. And each time he catches himself, Luna's words echo in his mind, not as accusation but as reminder. And this internalization of her voice becomes one of the most haunting elements of the continuation, because it shows how love can persist as guidance rather than presence, shaping behavior long after the relationship has ended. And Will begins to speak up in moments where he once would have stayed quiet, to ask questions that feel intrusive but necessary, and to pause when his instinct is to move forward without consensus. And these changes are subtle, often unnoticed by others, but profoundly significant to him because they represent a shift from unconscious privilege to intentional partnership. At the same time, the continuation does not allow Will to escape the full weight of his regret, and there are moments where the guilt resurfaces with renewed intensity, triggered by small, unexpected reminders of Luna's kindness, her tendency to minimize herself, her habit of saying it's fine, when it wasn't. And these moments underscore the script's refusal to frame growth as closure, because there is no version of this story where Will feels finished with his grief, no neat resolution, where the pain is transformed into something noble and contained. Instead, the script insists on honesty, portraying grief as something that becomes woven into the fabric of a life rather than resolved. And Will's task is not to overcome it but to integrate it without allowing it to calcify into self-punishment or denial. One of the most powerful developments in the continuation is Will's decision to share Luna's truth with others, not the letter itself, which remains private, but the lesson it taught him. And this act of articulation marks a significant departure from his earlier assumptions about communication, because he begins to understand that silence does not only harm the person who keeps it but also those who might learn from its breaking. And in speaking openly about the importance of asking, listening, and creating space for vulnerability, Will transforms Luna's hidden pain into a catalyst for change beyond their relationship. And this expansion of impact honors her in a way that feels earned rather than sentimental, because it acknowledges that while her silence was tragic, her truth can still be generative. The continuation also revisits the question of intent versus impact, a theme introduced in Luna's letter but explored more deeply through Will's ongoing self-examination. And he grapples with the uncomfortable reality that good intentions do not negate harm, that love without attentiveness can still wound, and that being unaware is not the same as being innocent. And this grappling is portrayed not as self-flagellation but as ethical awakening, a recognition that accountability does not require cruelty toward oneself but does require honesty. And Will learns to hold compassion for both Luna and himself without collapsing the distinction between understanding and excuse. As the script moves toward its final act, the focus shifts from Will's internal reckoning to his outward choices, and the audience sees him make decisions that prioritize mutual presence over solitary ambition, not as sacrifice but as recalibration, and these decisions are not framed as him becoming a better man in a simplistic sense, but as him becoming a more conscious one, aware of how easily love can be lost not through betrayal but through neglect disguised as trust. And the final scenes echo the emotional tone of Luna's letter, quiet, reflective, and unafraid of ambiguity, because the story does not promise that Will never repeat his mistakes, only that he will recognize them sooner, and that recognition, hard-won and incomplete, is presented as the most honest form of change. In the closing moments, Will returns to the letter one last time, not to reread it but to acknowledge it, and this distinction matters, because it signifies a shift from fixation to integration, from being consumed by what he missed to being guided by what he learned, and the script ends not with closure but with continuation, a life still unfolding under the shadow of a truth revealed too late, and the audience is left with a sense of quiet resolve rather than catharsis, because the story's power lies not in dramatic resolution but in its insistence that love demands more than feeling, it demands attention, courage, and the willingness to make space for truths that might disrupt our plans. And in carrying Luna's hidden words forward into a more honest way of living, Will Spencer ensures that while her goodbye letter arrived too late to save her, it did not arrive too late to matter. Time does not soften the truth Luna left behind. It only changes the way it presses against Will Spencer's life, and the next movement of the story follows him as that pressure reshapes not just his choices but his sense of identity, because grief, when paired with revelation, has a way of dismantling the scaffolding we build around who we think we are. And Will begins to realize that the man he was before the letter no longer exists in any usable form, not because he was cruel or unloving but because he was incomplete, operating on assumptions that now feel dangerously fragile. And this realization arrives not in a single epiphany but in a series of quiet disruptions, moments where his old instincts surface and are immediately interrogated by the memory of Luna's voice, not as it sounded aloud, but as it existed on the page. Measured, careful, and devastatingly honest. As weeks turn into months, Will discovers that the hardest part of living with Luna's truth is not the pain of missing her but the responsibility of remembrance, because remembering is not passive. It asks something of him every day, and the story makes clear that memory, when it carries moral weight, becomes an active force, guiding behavior, shaping priorities, and demanding accountability, and Will begins to feel that to forget, even briefly, would be a betrayal not only of Luna but of the lesson she entrusted to him without intending to, and this sense of obligation both steadies and exhausts him, because it leaves no room for emotional autopilot, no refuge in ignorance or assumption. One of the most striking developments in this continuation is Will's growing discomfort with certainty, a trait that once defined him and now feels suspect, because certainty was what allowed him to move forward without checking in, to interpret silence as consent, and to mistake calm for contentment. And as he becomes more aware of this pattern, he begins to resist the urge to resolve ambiguity too quickly, allowing conversations to remain open-ended, allowing discomfort to linger long enough for honesty to emerge. And this shift is subtle but profound, because it represents a move away from control toward curiosity, from outcome-driven interaction toward presence-driven connection. And the script treats this not as a moral triumph but as a skill Will must practice, often clumsily, sometimes unsuccessfully, and always consciously. The story also explores how Will's grief changes the way others see him, because transformation rarely goes unnoticed, and those who knew him before sense a difference they can't quite name, a hesitation where there was once momentum, a listening posture where there was once decisive speech, and some interpret this as loss of confidence, others as maturity, but Will understands it as vigilance, a refusal to move through relationships without awareness. And this vigilance isolates him at times, because not everyone is comfortable with the depth of attention he now brings, not everyone wants to be asked how they are really doing, and these moments introduce a new kind of loneliness, distinct from the grief of losing Luna but connected to it because choosing presence over ease often comes at the cost of simplicity. As the continuation unfolds, Will begins to encounter stories that mirror Luna's in unexpected ways, narratives of people who made themselves smaller for the sake of harmony, who withheld needs to preserve momentum, and who believed that love was proven through endurance rather than expression. And these encounters unsettle him, because they reveal how widespread Luna's silence truly was, not as an individual failing but as a cultural pattern. And the script subtly expands its scope here, moving from the intimate tragedy of one relationship to a broader commentary on how society often rewards quiet sacrifice while praising it as strength. And Will starts to see Luna not just as a singular loss but as a representative one, her story echoing through countless others who were never taught how to ask for more without feeling like a burden. This realization becomes a catalyst for action, not in a grand or performative way, but through small, deliberate interventions. Moments where Will speaks up when he senses someone minimizing themselves, moments where he names emotional labor that would otherwise go unnoticed, and moments where he pauses a conversation to ask whether everyone involved truly agrees with the direction it's taking. And these actions are not always welcomed, sometimes met with defensiveness or confusion, but Will persists because he understands now that silence often masquerades as peace, and that disrupting it can be an act of care. And in this way, Luna's hidden truth begins to ripple outward, influencing interactions far beyond the confines of their relationship. At the same time, the script remains deeply attuned to Will's internal struggle, particularly the tension between honoring Luna and allowing himself to move forward. Because growth rooted in loss can easily harden into self-surveillance, a constant measuring of one's actions against a past that can never be corrected, and Will wrestles with this, aware that turning Luna's letter into a moral ledger would reduce her to a lesson rather than a person. And this awareness prompts one of the most nuanced arcs in the continuation. Will's gradual shift from guilt-driven change to values-driven change, a distinction that matters because guilt seeks punishment while values seek alignment. And Will learns, slowly and imperfectly, to let Luna's truth inform his choices without allowing it to define his worth. This shift is marked by moments of release that are neither dramatic nor final but quietly significant, such as the first time Will laughs without immediately feeling the need to apologize to her memory, or the first time he makes a decision based on joy rather than obligation. And these moments are portrayed not as betrayals of Luna but as evidence that her love, though expressed through silence, was never meant to imprison him, and this reframing allows Will to hold both grief and vitality at once, to acknowledge that carrying Luna forward does not mean standing still where she left him. The continuation also deepens the exploration of voice, particularly whose voices are heard and whose are deferred, and Will becomes increasingly aware of how often he once filled silence with his own interpretations, assuming understanding rather than seeking it, and now he practices restraint, allowing others to finish thoughts even when pauses stretch uncomfortably long. And this practice reveals truths that would have otherwise remained hidden, frustrations voiced, needs articulated, boundaries clarified, and each time this happens Will feels both relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth is spoken, sorrow that Luna never felt safe enough to do the same. And this duality becomes a defining feature of his emotional life, a constant oscillation between gratitude and grief. As the narrative approaches its later stages, Will faces a pivotal choice that tests everything he has learned. A moment where pursuing a long-held ambition would once again require prioritizing his own trajectory over relational presence. And the script does not frame this choice as a simple moral dilemma but as a complex negotiation between desire and responsibility. And Will's struggle here is intense.